You're listening to the Potaholics Comedy Network. Potaholics.com.
Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name is Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
And this week we are continuing the conversation we had last week, which is Chapter 28 of The Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen L. Kent. We left off on the trouble Nintendo had after launching the N64. Mike, tell us more.
Nintendo had a big problem in that the cartridge format was expensive and it didn't hold as much data as CD-ROMs did. So at launch, Nintendo ain't got no games. We briefly mentioned this.
Only 2 games.
Yeah, they had Pilot Wings and they had Super Mario 64. 2 great games. But
no Jaybird.
No Jaybird. That's for damn sure. Okay,
yeah.
No Jaybird. Almost all of their games were bestsellers because there just weren't that many people. Like, there weren't that many games, and there were a lot of people buying them. So that's why they were all bestsellers. Because Nintendo, their argument was, well, all our games sell over 1 million copies. And it's like, yeah, because you have 5 games. And, like, tons of people bought Nintendo 64s. So naturally, you're going to have these. So I wanted to talk about this next game. This was the first problem game that they released for Nintendo 64. And this game is very important because I played this game ad nauseum. It is Cruisin' USA. Do you remember this game, Tyler?
Yes. I played a bit of Cruisin' USA, but I played a lot of Cruisin' World.
Oh, yeah. See, Cruisin' USA was my jam. I still have the cartridge. It's in this room right now as I speak.
And that's one where you get to go on the roof of the White House and hang out with Bill Clinton?
Yeah. And it's like, Cruisin' USA. Yeah. And it always starts with like a flag drop and like a bikini lady. It's very much like what you think of a 90s racing game would be like. But the big problem with the game and why it looked so terrible was the frame rate. Like, it just looked really choppy as you were playing this game. And it had, I think the frames were just not good. It was not smooth. But the only real cool things, the reason that I loved it as a kid, and this is not in the book, this is all me sharing a trade secret of Cruisin' USA. If you press all of the yellow C buttons at the same time in the car collection screen, then 4 secret cars pop up in place of the 4 cars you can pick. And one of them was the cop car. That's the one I would always use because you turn the siren on and off. It was really cool. So
that's pretty cool.
Throwing it out there. You know, if you ever want to play Cruisin' USA, press all those C buttons and get yourself a secret car. So the game, the reason there just wasn't a lot of stuff Nintendo could do with the cartridge format. And that's why you had games like Cruisin' USA that didn't feel like they were finished all the way. Another game that was not great was the Mortal Kombat trilogy for N64. In this case, it had a PlayStation version of the game too, and you just got to see how much more superior the game was on CD-ROM. Like, N64 had really low quality tinny music because it couldn't hold big music files in the cartridge format, whereas a CD-ROM can hold tons of digital music that sounds really good. And then while at times it did load faster than the PlayStation version, it didn't load faster at the times where it shouldn't be a problem. Like, it reported having really slow loading times when you had, it was 3 to 4 second delay when you were trying to load a character in multiplayer.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of a big deal. Like, this isn't even a loading screen. This is just the game, like, freezes for 3 seconds and then the character appears, which is pretty bad.
Yeah.
There are also some great games, though. I don't want to say there's all bad games because this is the era. Like, I would say in the first year you have Wave Race 64, which is an amazing game. Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye 007, which we're going to talk about in a second, and Star Fox 64. So, like, those are huge. Those are like classic N64 games. So while they did have these bad games, they had the good ones too. So it's not all bad for Nintendo, but it's about to get much worse when they lose a very special partner. And you're going to talk about this part.
Their partner that they lose is Square. It wasn't Square Enix then, it was just Square or Squaresoft.
Oh, it's Squaresoft. Oh.
Squaresoft specialized in RPGs. They made games like Final Fantasy, among others. I can't think of any from this era off the top of my head.
Trigger?
Oh yeah, they made Chrono Trigger. They made Super Mario RPG.
Yeah, Secrets of Mana is the other one mentioned in the book.
Oh yeah. They did not make
there.
the Dragon Quest series. That was Enix, so they would later merge with Enix.
You know, that's what I was wondering, because see, I don't know a lot about Final Fantasy or Squaresoft or Enix, and I did not know that that's when I don't know when they combined together. Like I have no idea
It was
when
like
that happens.
2002, I want to say. That's just pulling off the top of my head because I know the first Kingdom Hearts game is Squaresoft, and the second one is definitely Square Enix. So,
Oh, I didn't know they did Kingdom Hearts too.
yep, those
That's
are
awesome.
also
All
great
right.
games. But in Final Fantasy, you make your way through the story. You collect experience points by beating baddies, and that gets you new skills. You get stronger. You level up. You kill stuff so that you can get stronger, so you can kill more stuff. And then by the end, you've saved the world and stuff like that. Square, yeah, it was, oh man, so good. So I want to talk a bit about Hironobu Sakaguchi. He didn't start in RPGs. He's the guy who made Final Fantasy. He didn't start in RPGs. We did some independent off-book stuff here, but he actually wanted to be a musician. He was a college dropout. He studied electrical engineering at Yokohama National University, but then in the middle of semester, he just left. But while he was there, he became fascinated with the Apple II computer, probably an avid Jaybird player like myself.
I hope so.
I can only assume that he was heavily inspired
Probably
by Jaybird.
all about Jaybird. That's probably what really guided him in his entire video game design journey was Jaybird.
Yep. He wanted an Apple II, but he could only afford a knockoff at first. That's actually why he joined Square. He joined them part-time just to pay the bills, as you do with the job. But he still wanted to be a musician. He ended up designing 3 computer games before exclusively designing for the Famicom. He designed Highway Star, which was called Rad Racer in the US, King's Knight, and World Runner. He was not in any way happy or interested in those games, which is very funny.
Yeah, I think he just didn't care. He was just like, I don't feel anything, which is really sad. Like he had no passion behind him.
That's really sad too, because there's like tons of people who would have loved to make those games probably, but just it's the way it goes. Highway Star and World Runner did sell 500,000 copies, which is pretty good. So he just like was making these great games in his sleep. But what he wanted to do was challenge himself by writing something a little bit more interesting. So he went to the president of Square and he said, I want to do an RPG.
Ooh, hey, I have a quote right here I was going to read. Can I read the quote?
Oh, okay. Yeah,
is
read
that
the quote.
Cool? This is from Hironobu Sakaguchi. Wow, I just lost all sense of reading. Here we go. The only person you had to go to at the time was the president of the company, and he didn't really understand games that well. Selling him on the concept of an RPG wasn't that hard. I just went up and said, I want to do an RPG. He said, is that good? Is that interesting? And I said, yeah, it's fun. So he said, okay. That's the origins of Final Fantasy.
I love that.
That
it's
was
just
really
like the
funny.
president's just like, you know what? I do what you want because I trust you. We'll make a good game. So just do it.
All right, let's just do it. So there it is.
Yeah, it's always fun to go to your boss with like, hey, I have this idea. I want to do this, and then they're just like, well, do you think that's a good idea? I'm like, well, yeah, that's why I brought it to you. And they're just like, okay, cool. Well, I'll do it then.
Yeah, go for it. Oh, by the way, I looked it up, and Square Enix formed together and became Squaresoft and Enix merged together on April 1st, 2003. April Fool's Day.
Oh, 2003. Okay.
Yeah. So that's when it happened.
So they were Square Enix when Final Fantasy X-2 came out then, but not for X-1.
No. Yeah, I didn't know. It's very interesting. So
anyway,
I know a lot about that.
Sakaguchi planned to quit games after making this last game. That's why he called it Final Fantasy. I had also heard other reasons the game was called Final Fantasy, like Square was on its last legs and they really needed a hit here, and this was probably going to be their last game, so they called it Final Fantasy. I'm sure the truth is somewhere
many rumors
in between those things. This game was much more labor intensive than his other games. He needed, wait for it, 15 people to help him make this game.
I think the other games was 4. That's how many he had for the Runner one and Rad Racer. Yeah, World Runner, King's Knight, and Rad Racer. Just like 4 people. So this was getting up
crazy.
there.
Games take hundreds of people now.
Yeah,
that's nuts. So back then, he worked backwards. When designing a game, Sakaguchi always writes the story first and then builds everything around that. So back then, he had to see what he could do technologically and then sort of start there. Final Fantasy was huge in Japan. It was just a monstrous thing. It was so big that Nintendo published it in the US under its own label. Like Nintendo was just like, we'll take this to the US and we will publish it. This started a relationship between Nintendo and Squaresoft. In the early 90s, they released Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, like you were saying, a bunch of other games, and more Final Fantasy games. The partnership between Nintendo and Squaresoft was so important, it was once covered in Business Week.
That's pretty big, you know? So it's a business magazine weekly. It's pretty big.
That's pretty big.
It's got to be super big.
It's important to mention that while Final Fantasy had sort of a cult following in the US, it never really sold as well as it did in Japan. Squaresoft did not release Final Fantasy 2, 3, or 5 in the US. So when the market slumped in 1994, they did release Final Fantasy 6 for the Super Nintendo, but they called it Final Fantasy 3 because it was the third Final Fantasy they had released in the United States. So, but prior to Final Fantasy 7, these games would come out in Japan, and then like half the time they would come out in the US. So we had the first Final Fantasy, that one came out on the NES in the US. The second and third Final Fantasies were also NES games, but they did not come out in the United States. So when Final Fantasy IV was the first Super Nintendo one, when Nintendo decided to release that on the Super Nintendo, they were like, well, we can't just skip 2 and 3 and go straight to 4 if we never released them here, so we'll just call this one 2. So in the US, Final Fantasy 2 is a Super Nintendo game, and it is Final Fantasy 4. And then they didn't release Final Fantasy 5. Yeah. And then 6, so they skipped 5 again. They said it's too hard for Americans. They won't like it. But when 6 came out, they were like, yeah, we got a hit here. So they released 6 on the Super Nintendo as Final Fantasy 3.
That is so confusing.
Yeah.
And there were people that knew about that, and they were just like, I'll never get to play Final Fantasy 2 for NES.
Oh, yeah. There were people who would like import it, and then there's like probably a whole like group of people who learned Japanese like just to play these games, I bet.
That's so crazy.
They would eventually come out in various forms. Final Fantasy 2 would come out, I think, in the US for first time in like a compilation thing on the PlayStation. Final Fantasy 3 never got a US release until the DS 3D remake in 2006. And it was like a full-on 3D remake of Final Fantasy 3. That was the NES game. And then 5 did come out on PlayStation also in another anthology thing. So yeah, there's some weirdness going on there. From 7 on, all of them would come out in the US, and starting with 7, Square made a clean break decision to just be like, you know what? We're going to skip 4, 5, 6, and we're just going to start calling them 7, and we're going to keep it the same number.
Going from 7.
So, yeah. I would love to do a whole episode on Final Fantasy series, and maybe we will someday.
We're gonna. It might even be a 2-parter. I mean, there's so many games.
Big fan.
Many games.
Final Fantasy got games.
I got so many games.
So, yeah. Back to Square, though. The last game they made for Nintendo was Super Mario RPG. That's a pretty sweet game. It had this like pseudo 3D look to it. So it was Mario characters with a lot of new Mario characters like Mario, Peach, and Bowser, and I think Yoshi's in there. And it's like very much like a Japanese RPG game with like turn-based battles, random battles that kind of happen on the field. There's some like minor like light platforming stuff in there. So it's a pretty cool game. It did break Nintendo's conservative expectations of the game because of its super sweet graphics, and people were starting to get wise in the US that JRPGs are pretty cool.
They're like, hey, these games are fun. What have we been doing this whole time?
Yeah, exactly.
We're the US of A. That's a good impression.
We figured it out.
I pretty much nailed the impression.
That was good. Yeah, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you weren't US of A.
I'm really getting into acting, so.
So right when Nintendo unveiled the Nintendo 64, Squaresoft announced it was switching sides to Sony and that they would now make games exclusively for the PlayStation. The biggest reason for this was because Nintendo used cartridges on the N64. And Square was like, well, we have these gigantic games that are going to take up more than one CD. How do you expect us to fit all this into a cartridge? And Nintendo was like, we don't expect you to fit that into a cartridge. And Square was like, that's right. And we're going to Sony.
Dude, that's so funny because I remember getting Final Fantasy VIII and being like, how many discs is this game? And not realizing it. I'm like, why is it in such a big case?
Yeah. Yeah, 7 is like 3 discs, and then 8 and 9 are both 4 discs. Crazy.
It's nuts. I love playing it, though, and then being like, please put in disc 4 or whatever.
Yeah. It's a like, there is something very satisfying about reaching the end of a disc in one of those games, and it's like disc 2, and you're like, yes.
You're like, I've done it.
Yeah. So this split was very, very bitter. Nintendo and Square had been buddies for so long. They had worked together. They loved each other, but Nintendo was pretty mad about it. So Square didn't make any games at all for the Nintendo 64. Not a single one. And then when Nintendo announced the Dolphin, which would later go on to be called the GameCube, Nintendo was asked if they would let Squaresoft make games for the new console, and Minoru Arakawa said, I do not think it is yet time for Squaresoft. So this is like years later in like 2000, so we're talking 6 or 7 years later. He's still mad about this.
He's like, no, Squaresoft has lost us.
We are never, ever, ever getting back together.
Mm-hmm. It's a
Remember
very,
RoccoW was very like Taylor Swift.
and then
how
he
conducts
Taylor
business.
Swift, and the people at Squaresoft have been playing Since You've Been Gone by Kelly Clarkson, because they're like, I can breathe for the first time. I'm moving on, and then they're Taylor Swift. If we're basing this off of what companies listen to what breakup songs, Tyler and I have you covered. Don't even worry about it. We have it. We just nailed it. It's going to be our big history thesis at the end of this podcast.
Yeah, this is how it all wraps together as we sort of go back and we explain how every single one of these things relates to some breakup song.
Yeah, it's very important for us. And also,
the
it'll show our
Nintendo and
vast
Sony
knowledge of pop music.
Yep. The Nintendo and Sony breakup song over the PlayStation is, it'll shock you. That's all I'm saying.
Ooh.
We're getting real clickbaity here.
Here we are.
Okay, so the next game released by Sakaguchi was in 1997, and it was Final Fantasy VII, which was a huge game, one of my personal favorites of all time, and that one would go on to become the biggest game of 1997 and make RPGs finally break into the US market for good. Once Final Fantasy VII came out, it was very clear to people like, oh, these are awesome games. We should play them all. So 7 was a massive hit. 8 and 9 did well. It just continues.
Blew up.
I love 7. We could do a whole episode on 7. Actually, Polygon.com has a great article. It's a big featured article. It's big enough that they made like a book of it called The Oral History of Final Fantasy VII, and it's just like people telling their stories about the development of Final Fantasy VII, and
That's
it is
really cool.
super worth the read. That's on Polygon.com.
Ooh.
But the coolest thing about Final Fantasy VII was those super sweet cutscenes, because you could have pre-rendered full motion video cutscenes on CDs with awesome music. And so that really helped Sakaguchi tell the stories he wanted to tell, because he could make it almost like a movie, basically. And he couldn't do that on the Nintendo 64. There just wasn't storage space on the cartridges for it. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII sold 6 million copies worldwide.
There's so many
That's
copies.
nuts.
Good
It's
for
such
Final Fantasy.
That game's so good, dude. It's still expensive if you can find like a non-greatest hits version of the disc
Of the
somewhere.
original? Oh.
Yeah, it is. It's very expensive now. I think like if you got a sealed version of a non-greatest hits, like hundreds of dollars. Man,
Is it kind of like Earthbound? Isn't Earthbound for SNES?
Yeah.
Like if that's a new inbox copy, it's super expensive.
Yeah, Earthbound is also kind of the same way.
With NES. Okay, now I am going to talk about GoldenEye 007 for the Nintendo 64. Because
The other biggest game of 1997.
the other biggest game in 1997. So a few years after the movie came out, Rare and Nintendo released GoldenEye 007. And if you are not familiar with GoldenEye, it is a game based on the James Bond movie starring Pierce Brosnan. And this is back in the time that a game being based on a movie didn't automatically mean that the game was like completely bad. Like now, if you see a game that's like the movie version, and it's like for example, I mean, I guess it goes the other way around. Like a good video game never makes a good movie usually.
Yeah.
And a good
movie never makes a good
makes a good video game. Yeah, I can't think of an example right now, but I'm sure there's some sort of Fast and the Furious game that's not great. I'm sure of it. So, in fact, GoldenEye 007 was actually like a really, really good game. And it kind of had a slow start, but it gained a lot of ground with like word of mouth praise, and it would go on to sell nearly 5 million units in 1997. It actually came out at a really slow time. It was released in August. Yeah. Which everyone considered like a very slow time for video games, and it just had a slow build, and it got really, really big. Like, I mean, we actually have some more notes here about the movie tie-ins. Like, the further away from the movie, the better for a game. Like if it's rushed to release with the movie, it's going to be bad. If it's released significantly before or significantly after, that's usually a good sign. Except for Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 is a masterpiece, and it came out right when the movie came out, and it was just crazy that worked out that way. Right, Tyler?
That movie's great too. Yeah. That is the exception. Great movie, great game. Came out at the same time. Just awesome. If you haven't played Spider-Man 2, it was, yeah.
Yeah.
If you haven't played Spider-Man 2, you should play that game. Not on PC. PC version is totally different and bad. PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube versions, good.
Good, yeah. So the GoldenEye 007 was a first-person shooter on the N64, and it sort of became the benchmark by which all first-person shooter games on console would be judged, at least until Halo on Xbox. This was the one that everyone would go back to.
Yep.
The general gameplay was to move through each level, killing the enemies and getting your way. And basically, it was like Doom with a James Bond skin and like polygonal graphics, I guess you could say. And I mean, all everyone knows, like playing against your friends was super fun on the N64 because you'd have 4 controllers and then one person would play as Odd Job and everyone would get really mad, and that's just the game. So
Slappers only. Slappers only.
Slappers only was the best. Beyond just being a great game, though, the game's T rating showed that Nintendo wasn't just a company that made games for kids, and this is going to be a big deal because now they could compete with Sega and Sony's world and make games for older kids and adults, and that would work really well for them and would also work really poorly for them. And it came at a price for their PR department. And Tyler is going to talk about why.
Yeah. So in the years surrounding GoldenEye 007, there would be a few like high profile school shootings. There was Pearl High School in Paducah, Kentucky. There's a couple more in 1998. And then in 1999, the Columbine High School event happened. This shooting was a pivotal moment in American history. It was one of the most gruesome up to that point, and it had been preceded by several other pretty bad shootings. So the nation was grieving, and it was looking for ways to explain what had happened. Were there things that could have been done to prevent it? Like, what could have influenced these kids to do such horrible things? Well, the two guys that perpetrated Columbine, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, they filmed themselves right before they executed their plans. They talked about what they wanted to do, and they made a lot of references to Doom. They played a lot of it, and the rumor is that they even had made their own like maps for the game that was based on the school. And there were some like really obscure references in that video too to like Doom things that happened in the novels. Like these guys were big into Doom. And as we all know, Doom is a very gory, violent, shoot 'em up game. So when the media caught wind of this, they just kind of ran with it. So when they looked at all these other school shootings, a lot of them had also been carried out by kids that played video games, violent video games. So we got round 2 of congressional hearings. We talked about this in detail the first time in the early 90s when before games had rating systems, stuff like that. The book goes into a lot of detail on what the specific senator said, but I think the most important thing to take away from this is that the conversation still wasn't over. They did some stuff in the early 90s, but we were still talking about it. They didn't cover a whole lot of ground this time, since the games industry this time presented a unified front. They came in, most of the publishers and the developers were part of the IDSA, and they had submitted their games to be rated by the ESRB. And so when they came in, they were just basically like, well, what do you want us to do? Do you want to making these games be illegal, or like what are we doing here? Because we have a rating system, and here's what we'll do. We'll tell stores, like, we'll encourage them to enforce it, because the game companies can't enforce it themselves. They can only encourage the stores to enforce it. The game started being compared to military simulators, and in fact, many games had been licensed to the military as a way to help soldiers become desensitized to like killing actual people. So in World War II, soldiers were really well trained to be able to shoot a target accurately. They could shoot those bullseyes, but when it came time to shoot other people, a lot of them froze up, which made the military realize, well, we can't have that happening in the middle of war. We need to sort of desensitize people. And so that's when they started using like video games. Like this was later on after World War II, obviously, when video games became a thing, but they started using video games to sort of desensitize people.
Yeah,
so
I think they said that they started with like pop-up targets shaped like people, and then that just evolved into your standard issue like Area 51 looking shooter, where you like look at a screen and you just shoot people. So sorry to digress in there, but
the narrative at this point, it becomes like, why the heck are we letting our kids play the things the military uses to train soldiers? Like, doesn't that seem crazy? And like, when you think about it, it kind of does. So they weren't really asking for an outright ban on video games, but they wanted to make sure that they were being regulated so that they didn't get into the wrong hands. And that was kind of the main argument. So not a whole lot changed, but it did sort of bring this into the public's eye once again. I know growing up, my mom always like kept an eye on ratings and things like that. And like before I was 13, she was not going to let me play teen rated games.
Me too.
And even after I was 13, like there were, I can remember I was playing some like Medal of Honor or Call of Duty game, and my mom was watching me, and she was like, "This is crazy. You can't play this game," even though I was like old enough to play it based on the rating. I still played those games because you can't really ban things like that from kids. Sorry, Mom. Still played them.
Kids are going to get away to play Mortal Kombat. They're going to.
That's right. Yep. Still played them, but, she did her best and she did a great job.
I would 100% switch paintball mode on and off when my mom came into the room for GoldenEye and Perfect Dark.
Yeah.
So my favorite thing from this whole thing, because I think we pretty much described it right, where it's like, yeah, it's pretty much a lot of hysteria going on and people are just looking for something to blame, and video games got kind of caught in the crossfire this time because, yeah, like you said, there's already ratings and stuff. But there was a lieutenant colonel, he's retired, Dave Grossman, was a guy that he testified at these hearings. And the best thing from the whole book in this chapter, in my opinion, is this. It says, the Army has a device. I will bring pictures. The last time I trained on that puppy, it had a label. And on that, it said Nintendo. And then there's a little star. And if you go to the footnote at the bottom of the page, it says, it later became clear that Nintendo had never had a contract to create military simulations for the Army. So it's a lot of like hysteria of people being like saying a lot of stuff and talking a big game. Like, this has got to be the cause. Like, because everyone's obviously mourning and furious, and it was really, that's what sparked this one. I mean, I think it really didn't really have an ending. Even the chapter ends with the senator that brought it up saying, yeah, I mean, I think we had some good conversations, but I don't really know what's going to come of it. And
yeah,
it was really interesting.
But it is important to note that like by this time, everybody played video games like in some form or another. So it doesn't seem that crazy to see that like, oh, some of these people did some bad things and they also play video games. It's like a correlation does not imply causation. Like I remember Stan Lee used to say when they a similar thing happened with comic books. And they'd say comic books are making our kids violent, whatever. And like, we went to juvie and every single kid in juvie reads comic books. And Stan Lee said, yeah, well, I bet they also all drink milk too.
Yeah.
It's like so.
It's like, yeah, they all like, I'll play basketball. I don't know, like just making up any sport, anything that kids do. You could just say something, yeah. So
right, yeah. So it's when there's a new thing like that, it always. It's like I feel like we went through that with Pokemon specifically, but we're also kind of going through it now with smartphones and like social media and stuff. And you say like, oh, what's wrong with all these people? Well, it must be this new thing, and there may be some truth to that. I don't really know, but yeah, it is. It's a thing that new industries go through is think of the children. Yeah. And they are important conversations to have. Like that's not to say that there is like literally no connection there. It is important to look into those things and like make sure, validate your assumptions.
Oh yeah, definitely. For sure. I remember actually going back to the comic book thing that all my friends that didn't like to read, that's the only way their parents could get them to read. So boom, in defense of comic books. Did you see that? Just now? Yeah.
Nice.
Got it. Nailed it. What are we doing here with these breakup songs, these comic book defenses? We're killing today. I love it. Anyway, so that's this chapter. We're going to go into some more stuff. We're kind of getting to the end of the book.
Yeah. It's going to be exciting when we can go off on our own. We won't have nearly as many quotes and like things like direct things that people have said, but I think we'll still have some interesting content.
Yeah, I think it'll be really fun, and I'm excited to get there. So I think this is the second to last chapter we're going into, and there might be a couple two-parters still coming up. I don't know. We'll see how long these chapters are and stuff. But anyway, Tyler, what have you been playing?
Man, it doesn't change. It's just Destiny. I actually canceled my World of Warcraft and my Final Fantasy 14 subscriptions. Wow. So when those run out, my FF14 is donezo. I'll probably still start that up at some other point, but it's just not happening soon. WoW, I think I'm done with it, man. Haven't played in a couple of weeks. There's like,
you're not into it again. You're gone.
The raid was just not as fun as I thought it was going to be. And
ooh, fighting words. I like that.
So yeah, like I did it, and I didn't finish it, I guess, but like, I got pretty far into it, and I was like, I guess that was okay. So, yeah, I'm just like, it just made me want to play Destiny, so now I just play Destiny.
Dude, I've been gone all weekend doing shows, stand-up comedy, colletacomedy.com, and small plugs. Nice. Yeah, see that? And I was just missing video games so much that I brought my Nintendo 2DS, and I played a lot of Pokemon this weekend.
All right.
And it was nice. I really enjoyed it. I was having fun. I didn't go through, I kind of took my time in this area, like way more than usual, like trying to collect stuff. And I was just playing casual, and I liked it. But I have a Destiny itch, a big time Destiny itch that we might have to scratch right after this podcast. So,
dude, I think, well, we can talk about this later, but we should raid soon.
The Festival of the Lost thing coming out too has really made me excited because I'm like, oh, you get to play this thing if you want to grind. It's a grind, but it's actually not that bad. I think it's
we should grind some Spooky Forest tonight.
Yeah, if you play like 10 matches of it, you're really close to getting the gun. It's like 9 shards.
It doesn't actually take that long.
It doesn't take that long at all. So I was like, in fact, you don't really even have to do all of the weekly bounties if you don't want to. And
it's a big upgrade if you get it because it's a max power.
600 power gun. I'm getting
this
that for
week
sure.
on Destiny Weekly, Codex, A History of Destiny.
Yeah, right. I know, but it's fun. I just like having this game as the one I always come back to, like the hobby game, and then I jump on different games throughout the week. And so I was playing Pokemon earlier this week, Pokemon Ultra Moon, and a big fan of it. And I actually kind of want to beat it really bad so I can pick up another 2DS game. I want to play Zelda really bad.
Yeah.
I've had a Zelda itch for a while. So.
Oh, dude, have you played Link Between Worlds?
No, that's the one I want to get.
Yeah, that one's great.
It's really you go 2D that one, right? You go.
Yeah.
It's so I really want to jump on that. Anyway, before I forget, we got a new review.
Oh,
let me read this new review. This is from Dark Broccoli. Thank you, Dark Broccoli. Best retro convo. I love these guys. Oh, that's so nice of you to say. No biased conversation, just facts and jokes about an amazing history of consoles and with no games. Unless you got Jaybird. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Dark Broccoli, for jumping on the Jaybird train and understanding it's the greatest game of all time.
Jaybird World Champions, my basement. Let's go.
It should be assumed, by the way, that when we say what you've been playing, we are always playing Jaybird.
Yeah. That's just background.
That's really just on all the time. It's like I set it up where I flip the light switch in my room and then Jaybird just comes on 5 screens. It's like an old guy in his garage with the radio turning on. It's exactly like that, but it's with Jaybird and all the Apple IIs I have plugged into my room. So
yeah.
Thank you, Dark Broccoli. We appreciate you.
The noise an Apple II makes when it turns on. I don't know if you've ever been around an Apple II and it turns on, but it makes this like really loud clicking noise. It sounds like it's definitely broken.
Oh, I think I've heard this. Yeah, I've heard this before. And I'm like, I thought it was broken when I first heard it.
Yeah.
I was like, what? Cool. Well, thank you, Dark Broccoli. As always, you can find Tyler at SneakerElf, ELPH, on Twitter. I'm at MeColetta. We're on Codex History of Video. No, wow.
Codex History Podcast at gmail.com.
Yeah, I almost just said our full title of our name. That's great. And then also, you can rate and review and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play. We're on all 3 of those, and probably whatever podcasting thing you listen to because it pulls off of that. So we're on there, and if you review us and rate us, we'd really appreciate it. And with that, I think we'll see y'all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been a Potaholics Comedy Network presentation. Potaholics.com